What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the fingers, getting into the drums here. Essentially going to see me speed run the entire process. I build the MIDI track, then I'm going to output it at each stage, essentially the raw tracks from Superior, then me taking it up to the first stage of enhancing the drums, if you will, where I basically use brow rising. I use some dynamics control and mid-side sort of EQing on the saturation. And then, of course, I take it up to the final stage where I do all the extra stuff before I output it as something that's going to be ready to be mastered, by adding some top end to it, some EQ, obviously, and some more sort of bottom end crushing, if you will, some reverb, you know, stereo widening, stuff like that. So if you're looking for, you know, a more in-depth video, watch the drum mechanics one. But here you're just going to watch me do in about 3 minutes, basically the entire drum track, which honestly took me about maybe 20 minutes to do, top to bottom. And if I wasn't sort of doing the video, it would have taken way less. So once you get going on it, it's pretty easy. And then come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the song foundations and how this is going to play into the hierarchy of instruments. And then in the next sort of installment of the course, we're going to actually break down the song in and of itself, with the bass guitar, the keyboard lines, and potential guitar lines stacked on top of it. Yes, the madness is truly beginning, so I sure hope you're paying attention in some of those other videos and keeping up with those triads with a bass note, because that's going to be essential for the next step. Nothing in this course is wasted. You think it's like, oh, this is kind of boring information. Trust me, later on it'll become invaluable, and the only way you can navigate is by knowing it from the start. Sorry, some of this stuff is really boring. That's just the nature of the game. That's why only certain people get the big bucks when it comes to music, because they're prepared to hunker down. If you're just trying to do it on talent alone, the gulf is pretty intimidating, if you will. So let's get into this speed run, and then we'll get back to the song foundations. All right, I'm not going to whinge on here for like a huge amount of time, but I just did want to touch on this right now because this is going to be crucial. I like to think of songs sort of from an engineering perspective. I guess it's because I used to be a tradesperson, so, you know, it makes sense. But the fact of the matter is that the drums are kind of like the foundation, the footings, and all the rest of that stuff. You know what I mean? And then you're going to build everything on top of that. So it has to be foundational. And trust me, a lot of people are like, I just like this song because the beat really moves me, or I love the groove, or whatever it is. So that can be 50 or even 60% of the battle right there, even more in modern day, because essentially drums is now so centrally focused. Now, of course, if you're a person like me, I can't do the simple 4 on the floor stuff. You heard from the example, I like to, you know, kick it up a notch to sort of push myself to be more interesting, creatively speaking. But you do you. You can do a lot with just a kick and a snare with fairly rhythmic beats. So decide for yourself. But after you get to that point, you have to start to break things down. Now, when I came up with the chord progression, I was just playing everything on the keyboard. But when I'm thinking about writing it as a song, I have to break all of those individual keyboard parts up into, yes, actual music parts. This is where SATB comes into play: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Okay. And basically that's how you arrange things. So in the bass range, I'm going to have all the bass keyboards, the bass guitar. If I have bass strings, the bass drum, right? Any, I guess you could say sub frequencies could probably go in there too, but in its own special category if you're doing that. Right. So that's another whole region. You have the drums, which basically is like the heartbeat, you know what I mean, of your song. And then the house that you're building on top of it's kind of like its soul, you know, its character. And so by breaking up the instruments, you give yourself a lot more sort of wiggle room. Here's the thing. Imagine your songs like got a whole bunch of little movable pieces, right? And that's true because you're dealing with independent melody lines, really. Some of them end up being 3 independent melody lines stacked on top of each other, a triad, right? And then you start moving in these triads, you create a chord melody, right? So not just a melody of individual notes, but a melody made from chords, right? And I can break those up into the various regions. And what happens is sometimes I'll play it and I'll be like, you know, if I move the bass note up here to this other sympathetic note, the 3rd, the 5th of the chord I'm working in, maybe an extension note, it sounds way better. And that's the beauty of sort of thinking in layers, if you will, or, you know, building upwards by floors using the SATB method. It just makes sense. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. You're like, I can just start by writing the simple bass line, get it done. Just by mimicking what you did with the chord progression. And then you can just lay the chords down, right? You can actually play them all on the keyboard or whatever it is that you're doing if you're doing that, and then just break up that one sort of MIDI file and just start deleting the other ones and keeping all of the bass notes. And then, of course, since you have that MIDI information, you can now use that to, you know, manipulate your song. Do different things with it, which you never even thought possible. And I'll show you what I'm talking about later on in the course. At first, you're just like, well, it's a bass note right now, but I might change that to a synth that has like this pumping sort of like, you know, arpeggiated feel, or something else, just some crazy bass sound from a synthesizer. There's literally no sort of limit once you start really applying your mind to it. And that's the point, is when you break them up into regions, it forces you to, again, concentrate on this one region and see how it interacts with the rest of the other regions. You know, for the tenor region, I really see that as the first set of triads. Or sometimes it's another bass note that may be sympathetic, so I'm creating 4th, 5th, 6th, 7ths in the bass and tenor now, and one of the other 2 notes is going to either form an interval or another triad that I'm going to stack on top of now the alto type triads, right? So I'm kind of expanding the idea. Instead of it just being one note, I see it as a region that I can now put a whole chord in there, and I can now take two of those chords and stack them on top of each other and have a bass note. And then finally I can have a bass note, a note that supplements the bass note that just adds more character to it if I want to, or I don't. I can have one triad and then another complementary triad. And the fact is one of these triads can be done in the keyboard or some other instruments with strings or some other simulation. And the other one can be done with the guitar itself or any other instrument like that, a mandolin or any other kind of, an acoustic guitar, whatever you want. You see what I mean? And then at the very top, instead of it just being the soprano, which it usually is, but that's like the melody stuff. It rides at the very top. That's your vocal line. That's your guitar solos, right? If you're doing that stuff. So breaking it up like that helps you sort of start to deconstruct. You like get the drums done first. Now all of a sudden I've got my foundation. Then all of a sudden you're going to start laying out the bass parts. And you're like, okay, this sounds awesome. You know what I mean? And you're going to start to work with it so that it makes sense. Because once you get the bass sort of settled, you're like, this is how I want it to sound. I was going to do like this kind of fake bass guitar or whatever, but it really didn't do much for me. I'm going to use this synthesizer thing instead because I want it to sound more 80s or new wave or whatever you want to call it. And that right there is the advantage. Now, later on, if you want to, you can just ditch the entire bass line altogether and play the bass yourself. That's obviously highly recommended. If you're playing guitar, you could easily play bass. You can buy a really nice bass for about $400. And it doesn't take too much to amp them up or whatever it is. You can basically almost go directly into your interface if you want to with just the preamp. So it doesn't sound that great, obviously, but there's a million effects for free on the internet. So I'm sure you can get something that's reasonable with some studio magic, and that's just it. You know what I mean? You're not limited to the keyboard if you don't have one or anything else. You don't even need a keyboard. You can just program this stuff right in. Look at a keyboard and just be like, okay, there's the linear scale of the notes, and just start plugging them in accordingly. And when you hear the chord, when you hit the space bar to hit play and you hear the chord and you're like, okay, that sounds right, or yikes, whoops. Trust me, you'll learn a lot about music by doing stuff like that. Just like you learn a lot about math by going out in the field and physically doing something. You know what I mean? Somebody can give you this really big complex formula that says, oh, if you take this heavy ball and you attach it to a string or something, you attach it and you put it next to your nose and you let it go and it goes way out. It won't come all the way back and smash you in the face. It starts to lose momentum. Now it's just science. Now, I can show you that using a bunch of math functions and whatnot. You'd be like, I have no idea what this person is talking about. I could just show you. You know what I mean? And then you're like, I understand. It's the same thing. In certain instances, you're like using your brain power. That kind of comes later on when you're more comfortable with it. But initially, just sort of getting in there and just messing around with the raw mechanics, you never know what you're going to come up with. And if you're keen, you'll actually sit there and figure out what it is that you're doing. You're like, oh, look, I'm adding a sixth there. That sounds awesome. And that'll trigger something in your mind. And maybe later on you'll be like, I should try that on the guitar. And that might spur a whole new sort of area for you to explore in terms of music. Just adding this one particular element to your practice session. Done. Okay. So the foundation elements are incredibly important. Don't just skip over them. I know a lot of people are probably watching these videos. They're kind of radically different. I'm like, yeah, it's because we're done with the kiddie stuff. There's here are some general guidelines. They're not rules. They're general guidelines because you can take these things and connect them together in hundreds and hundreds of different ways. So don't think of them as rules. The theory is there to give you an understanding of how these things interact, and they sort of stack on top of each other to come up with the basic building blocks that we use for music. But once you start getting into the creative process, those rules are subject to a massive amount of interpretation, as we've demonstrated over the centuries. So That's the thing. You got to sort of jump in there and don't limit yourself. That's the other thing. Just start. Just be like, I'm going to do it. One day I just started. I was like, go get the free software. And I just started making the recordings and they sucked. And then I just kept ramping up. And now my recordings sound pretty decent. And it took about 5 years really of, you know, on off work. I wouldn't say I put my nose to the grindstone or anything because it was just not possible. I was doing other things too, but just pecking away at it kind of situation. It took 5 years to go like, I can't make a mix worth shit to, yeah, that sounds half decent. Right? And that's all you're really looking for. And if you can do that, I can tell you right now, if you can do that, you will never be lacking when it comes to the music thing, and there'll always be opportunity. And trust me, there'll be more opportunity in the future as people get more nihilistic about the music. The people that are really, really into music and just do it because we love it just opens the door more for us. These people are interested in fame and fortune and recognition or whatever. We just want music to be part of our lives. That's why I highly recommend that you should be doing stuff like that, right? So, food for thoughts. Organize your thoughts so that you can more accurately lay out your ideas, number one. Number two, it gives you more flexibility when you want to go make alterations. Now you have individual regions for the bass. For one set of triads, this particular region expressing this melodic set of rules according to your song. This next one up here that can be complementary or whatever. And then finally the highest one, which is going to be all the melodies that would happen after the fact. You know, I mean, some people come up with vocal lines and stuff like that, but in my mind, after watching hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documentaries and the bands being interviewed and stuff like that, it's when they come up with the music and then they basically write the lyrics and the vocal lines after the fact that they really sound good. It usually can start off sometimes. It's like, oh, I started off with this great thing, but then it was the guitar line and the bass and everything else. It just really brought it all together. You know what I mean? So you might as well just start from that perspective from day one and just move outwards. And honestly, you know, you'll be more comfortable and ready to write something memorable. That's the hardest part. That's the magic with the melody, which will be at the very end of this course, is writing something that just, you know what I mean, catches the imagination, like that guitar line from More Than a Feeling, right? Or, you know, some of the stuff from Freebird or whatever it is, you know, like these ultra iconic guitar licks and stuff like that everybody knows and they love, or whatever it is. And it's just undeniable. That's the power of melody, and you have to harness it. And so, again, breaking things down into regions gives you the ability to be like, now I can just focus on this one region instead of trying to be like, well, I have to come up with everything at once. It just becomes an overwhelming mess and it just blows up in your face. Break it up. Get the drum track down. Mix it up to a point where you're like, it's good enough. Then start thinking about how you want to lay down the chord progression, and then lay that down like we'll do in the next set of lessons. And then finally, we'll start making alterations to it to fine tune it to make it sound the best. Job's done. Thanks for joining me. Appreciate every single one of you. We'll see you in the next one.